Hey guys, I'm Avni,
And I'm Diva,
and welcome back to Positionality.
where we definitely haven't been gone for the past 4 months.
So we totally didn't release like 4 episodes and then become completely MIA for like 4 months because we just suck at aligning our schedules and being on top of things.
Okay. As much as we can say that we suck, we did have valid reasons. Like, we're in high school, we had projects.
But we're back! I know last episode, whenever that was, we said we'd do an episode on the dark side of the toy industry. And we will, but we'd like to focus on some of a different topic just to get back into the swing of things. So this week we're going to talk about the Hong Kong protests that occurred in June 2020. Okay, have you heard of them?
Definitely. I mean, during the summer, it was honestly kind of terrifying to read the news and to read about some of these protests. But, like, it's definitely something that I knew about, but I didn't really understand the full history of it.
So, yeah, these protests, surprisingly, have been recognized as one of the largest in the city's history. Organizers of the protests say that more than 1 million people attended an initial march on June 9th, and an estimated 2 million people out of Hong Kong's population of 7 million joined within a week.
I mean, that's definitely impressive. Like, that just speaks to how important and significant these protests were at the time.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that, so Hong Kong is a part of China,
Yeah.
for those of you that are not as familiar with geography. So China is obviously an authoritarian regime, or the Chinese Communist Party is, and there's a ton of censorship and significant backlash if you do participate in any protest that goes against the government. So to have that much attention drawn from the public is incredible. But I guess it's worth going into why these protests occurred in the first place and what Hong Kong's relation to China is, because a lot of that stems from its history. Hong Kong was actually a United Kingdom's colony since 1841, and the UK basically occupied the area since the First Opium War, which basically occurred after there was like a Chinese crackdown on illegal opium trade that led to like widespread addiction in China. So obviously there's like this dynamic of power in the late 1800s-ish, where the UK is like, we want to be powerful, but China's doing that. So let's go in and let's like spread drugs, which is kind of smart, right? A very model UN thing to do. But they basically sold drugs to weaken the labor force in China so that China itself would cripple and the UK would be powerful. That's twisted.
Just a little bit.
You think? Anyway, but there was basically a treaty in order to stop this called the Treaty of Nanjing, in which China agreed to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British, and they eventually gained control over all three main regions of Hong Kong. So the island, Kowloon Peninsula, and then the New Territories, which is a swath of land that basically makes up the bulk of Hong Kong today. In 1898, a final treaty, the Convention for Extension of the Hong Kong Territory, was signed, which basically leased the new territories to Britain for a longer period of time. However, China would regain control of these lands in 1997. Here's the thing. China became a communist nation in 1949. So about 100,000 Chinese people found refuge in Hong Kong after the Communist Party took power, obviously because that would significantly hurt their economic standing and their overall welfare. This caused capitalist Hong Kong to experience an economic boom, and hence it became a home to like an international community for trade and things like that. However, once the treaty expired and 1997 began to come closer, the UK and China began to discuss Hong Kong's future and the way they would transition back into like this communist society. So they agreed that China would give Hong Kong some sort of political and social autonomy through like a one country, two systems policies for 50 years. So once Hong Kong was handed over to China, it became a special administrative region of China with its own constitution and a legal system and some democratic rights, such as the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. However, Hong Kong's residents cannot elect their own leaders. In fact, elections were conducted using a list of candidates vetted by Beijing, the capital of China, along with a bunch of Chinese policies that were enforced in 2014. This has caused a lot of public dissent because they're obviously not used to this sort of totalitarianism. And I think it's a really interesting look into the protests that have culminated from that.
So essentially, like, Hong Kong hasn't had much autonomy for the past 50 years, but it went from being a capitalist area, which had some sort of democratic rights, to now being under an authoritative regime.
I think it's important to note that there is, like, it's still a capitalist society economically, but in terms of its socio and political control, it is very much controlled by the CCP. So obviously Hong Kong is one of the largest trade centers of the world, so that contributes a significant amount to China's economy. Somewhat. There is a caveat to this, which we'll delve into a little bit after we go through the protests. But I think it's really interesting to look at the whole economic power versus development of human rights and how those actually contradict each other. One of the first attacks on human rights was the national security reform. So China in 2003-ish passed the Article 23, which prohibited treason, secession, sedition, and subversion against the Chinese government. It also outlawed theft of state secrets. These pieces of legislation basically drew fierce criticism from people of Hong Kong because they were worried that it would infringe upon their freedoms, and they were totally right. So this is the spark that draws a bunch of flames later on in history. For example, in 2012, they had the protests against the moral and national education policies. So essentially in that one, authorities attempted to amend the curriculum of Hong Kong to include topics on China's history, culture, and national identity, which would essentially influence Hong Kong's youth. So obviously a bunch of students, parents, and teachers rejected the idea because they thought it would brainwash Hong Kong's youth.
I mean, that's like blatant indoctrination.
Have you read the book 1984 by George Orwell?
I've heard of it.
Okay, so I have very briefly read it when I was a lot younger. And basically it is, so George Orwell's stories, like Animal Farm or 1984, they're very anecdotal in that they convey events that are very close to real-time history in the era in which he lived without necessarily mentioning specific names. So like with Animal Farm, say, it was very much along the lines of Stalin's communism and his regime without necessarily mentioning that it was Stalin itself. It was just a very accurate depiction where you could make the inferences. Similarly, 1984 is one book that delves into the dangers of totalitarianism and authoritarian regimes and just the dangers of capitalism in general, or not capitalism, but surveillance in general. One of the most powerful statements in this book is, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And this is one of the political party slogans in the book. And it can be really well interpreted as, if you in the present can control how one perceives the narrative of history, you can maintain your position of authority because you can erase so much of it.
I mean, it's totally dependent on, like, people understand history solely based on who's writing it. Like, I know last year in our AP US history class, at one point our teacher basically gave us an excerpt from our US history book and an excerpt from a Mexican history book, and basically compared how they both spoke about the war that occurred between Mexico and America. And, like, the contrast was astounding, honestly. Each basically blamed the other country for causing the conflict, which, like, you can imagine influences a lot about how citizens in each country probably view the other.
Even in the way we perceive our own history and popular or main figures in our own history. Like, for example, a lot of people perceive George Washington as a saint. However, with, like, recent news coming out, obviously he was a slave owner. He did a lot of things that were possibly normalized at the time, but obviously are not morally or ethically correct in our society today. This kind of ties into, like, Alexander Hamilton, the musical. But they were really obsessed, the founding fathers were really obsessed with creating this legacy so that people can perceive them in the most positive of light.
I mean, at the end of the day, though, whatever country that has the most power is the country that controls information and how that information is interpreted by people. So, like, being able to control how people view history is one of the most powerful things someone can do.
That being said, it also influences how one views the present, specifically with China. And we did a little bit about this on our Instagram. So go ahead and check that out. It's at Positionality Media.
Shameless plug.
Hey, you gotta get some self-promo somewhere.
Exactly.
But basically, we talked about the Uyghur genocide and how this minority group of Muslims in China are being held in concentration camps in China, essentially. And yet, a lot of people don't know about this issue. Luckily, there has been more coverage on it in recent months, which I'm really happy about. But China has been able to control the narrative for so long. Even from Google Maps or like Google Satellite, they've somehow been able to control who sees the concentration camps, which is an insane amount of control if you think about it.
I mean, it just speaks to how insanely powerful the censorship in China actually is. And you can imagine how that influences how we view the situation in Hong Kong.
Luckily, there is a group of secondary school students that was led by 15-year-old Joshua Wong, and this group is called Scholarism, and they tried to fight for the proposal. Now, this group, while their efforts don't seem as significant right now, Scholarism becomes one of the most influential protest groups in all of Hong Kong. For example, in 2014, they led the Umbrella Revolution for universal suffrage. So this movement was sparked by demands for the reform of Hong Kong's electoral system, quote unquote. They had proposals to grant universal suffrage in elections for city's leader, but at the time, the Chinese government only allowed voters to select from a list of candidates vetted by Beijing, and that was rejected by protesters who took to the streets to call for genuine democracy. They gained a lot of momentum after clashes between the police and mostly young demonstrators who tried to reclaim a public square that was closed off after the protests against national education. But these student protesters essentially occupied the streets around government buildings and office towers in the financial center. They stopped traffic and rendered major paths impassable. So clearly they had a significant impact on just the daily life of Hong Kong itself. The movement umbrella protests gets its name from like the umbrella protesters who used umbrellas as shields against the police pepper spray. Joshua Wong, who was 17 years old at the time, became the face of the movement and was later jailed for his involvement.
Wow.
So we're very close to his age.
I am 17.
And I'm 16, by the way. So we're obviously his age or very, very close. And it's insane how much courage a 17-year-old has just to do that in the first place. Second of all, it's sad that we have to rely on children to enact change.
I mean, you can see parallels that are happening even across like the world. In China, the student protesters led this movement, and you could think to about a year or two ago how students led the March for Our Lives protests against gun rights.
Yeah, against like the whole gun violence situation that was going on with high schools, especially around the Parkland shooting. I just think it kind of sucks that children have to be responsible for the issues that a lot of the adults have caused.
But on the flip side, it's almost nice to see that, like, our generation is able to do stuff like this now. It's good to know that we're able to have a say in the people who are governing us and the decisions that they're making.
I think especially having that insight at a younger age helps us become more aware of how we can react politically and socially in order to enact some of the most major changes in history. For example, not to get super political here because we're trying not to be, but the whole Capitol riots, a lot of protesters on social media were able to pinpoint that to President Trump and enact change through their legislators and governments and stuff like that. And then that's what enacted the whole impeachment trials.
Not to mention that people on social media were able to find the people who were part of those riots so that, justice could be served and they could be punished accordingly.
Just having general awareness of everything makes it a lot harder to be controlled in the first place. Hence, also kind of going back to the educational thing, why it's so important to have access to unlimited information in order to be able to make up your own mind about what's going on.
But unfortunately, the majority of Chinese citizens don't have that liberty.
This actually goes even further into cultural ties. So, of course, there was another incident, because why would there not be an incident?
Of course.
In 2016, we had the fishbowl riots in Hong Kong, and this was protesting a crackdown on street vendors. So basically, the CCP made an attempt to crack down on unlicensed food vendors in the city's Mong Kok district. So Hong Kong is obviously very well known for its street food. But of course, the government tried to shut everything down on the grounds of health and hygiene concerns. So violence erupted after 300 people took to the streets and clashed with the police, who fired warning shots, which is a very rare occurrence at Hong Kong protests. Now, while it might seem reasonable, because health and hygiene is obviously very important, it wasn't a fight against food regulations. To many Hong Kongers, the fishbowl hawkers were an emblem or a symbol of the city, as hot dog vendors are of New York. So it was essentially seen as an attack on Hong Kong's way of life. What happens when you can indoctrinate an entire group into getting rid of their cultural importance and cultural symbols and significance? Even as an immigrant in the US, sometimes you inadvertently try and lose a part of your culture in order to just fit in with whatever is accepted of you in society. But in that, you lose a lot of your own individual identity. So a government forcefully taking that away from someone is insanely unethical and immoral. And that's why these protests obviously erupted.
Yeah, in a sense, clearly the Chinese government was trying to take away some form of Hong Kong's identity, which is imperative to their autonomy as a state. But clearly that's exactly what China wants to stop.
This actually continues in further on, as thousands of people in 2016 attended a demonstration outside the city government's headquarters, calling for Hong Kong's complete independence from the mainland in August. So it was the first pro-independence protest in the city's history. So these independence groups began popping up after the 2014 Umbrella Revolution, and this rally was actually initiated when the Electoral Commission banned pro-independence candidates from running in elections for the city's legislature. Do I really need to say anything for this one? That's like if Trump said, Biden, I dislike your ideology, therefore you're just not allowed to run against me.
It's almost like banning libertarians from running.
Which is terrible. Diverse schools of thought is essentially what we thrive on, because we have differences in perspective, and therefore that enables a lot of growth. You and I have somewhat different perspectives on a lot of things, and we stay up till questionable hours discussing them. But it is a very interesting conversation every single time, because that enables for growth in terms of perspective as well as empathy. But I think it's really interesting because in 1984, Orwell says, "Don't you see that the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it." So just for context, newspeak is the language in which they speak in this fictitious society. That being said, newspeak is one language that has no negative language whatsoever, which is really interesting, because I think anything can be taken negatively if you put enough context behind it. For example, Diva, you're such a walnut.
I don't know that I can take that all that negatively, but...
To some people, that might be an endearing compliment. To others, it might be an insult. To me, I don't really know what that was. I'm just trying to give an example here.
I mean, I suppose all that means is that my sister is allergic to me, which isn't exactly false.
So, to me, that entire quote was super significant because it essentially is an example of how any attempt to counter ideology that might contradict what is pushed out by those who have power is gone because there's no essential way to access it in the first place. So the lack of freedom in thought and the lack of freedom in expression, as well as the lack of just freedom of assembly in general, contributes to a lack of dissent. Which, I mean, I don't know how significantly that's been working out for them, because there's clearly been a bunch of protests. We just named like 4 off the top of our heads. I mean, obviously with a bunch of research, but...
Like, the whole idea of that is entirely contradictory to individual autonomy and democracy, because democracy thrives on having diverse schools of thought, because that's like the whole point in having people run the government.
That being said, I think it's important to bring in this idea of cultural relativism. So, when we were talking about human rights, obviously we have the Universal Declaration of Independence, which was created post-World War II, so that a situation such as the Holocaust wouldn't happen again. However, there have been criticisms to this Universal Declaration in that it only accounts for Western ideas because only like Western, European, America, only those countries were present at the time. So then, is it fair to say that countries who do not decide to adapt to this are in their own right to do so because of sovereignty, as well as the idea that their cultural values come before the value of respecting some of these human rights?
I mean, it's very difficult to tell where that line should be drawn. Like, what makes a right universal and what makes it based on cultural significance? Because, like, one of the things that comes up is women's rights. And while we, as part of more of the Western world, think, like, women's rights are human rights, they're universal rights, a lot of Middle Eastern countries have different views on this. They're not necessarily saying that women don't deserve rights, but those rights are delivered in different ways. And it's debatable whether that's a universal thing or cultural relativism affects that.
And I also think it's just interesting to see the arguments between the two because a lot of China says it is within their right to do so because culturally they're trying to merge cultures by just, it seems innocent, right? Oh, we're just trying to teach you more about China's culture, China's history. We're just trying to help you get more accustomed to China's politics and policies. But what that ends up doing is infringing further upon the autonomy and rights of civilians in Hong Kong.
I mean, it's all right to try to introduce more of China's culture to Hong Kong, but it shouldn't come at the expense of the culture that's already built up in Hong Kong.
What's interesting is that they've intensified their clampdown on independence campaigns in recent years. So in 2018, they declared the Hong Kong National Party as an illegal society. I'm just gonna stop right there. That's like saying the Democrats or the Republicans or Libertarians or the Green Party are illegal societies because they just have contradicting ideologies. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people would agree with that sentiment, but we do not. We appreciate diverse perspectives and diversity in thought here. That's why we call ourselves positionality. But then further on in 2018, a foreign journalist was expelled from the country after hosting an interview with one of the group's co-founders. They're also controlling media and how much of this information or this independence ideology is not only being perpetuated within their borders, but also outside of their borders, which makes it harder for foreign nations to go ahead and intervene and help in some way.
That whole idea of, like, expelling a journalist solely for talking to someone with a diverse perspective, it kind of reminds me of the Alien and Sedition Acts from the 1800s, where John Adams enacted this, where, like, people weren't allowed to talk, the media, essentially, and news, weren't allowed to talk bad about the government. And in that era, even then, there was immediate backlash towards that because it was so blatantly not democratic.
I believe the president who enacted this, John Adams, he was not reelected because of these, and that like decreases popularity. What's interesting is that these were actually reintroduced, I believe, either in the Civil War era or the World War era, one of those two, so as to prevent any sort of negative backlash coming on within a war. Because obviously, if you have a significant detest for the war that you're fighting and putting so much money into, there's no point in fighting it anymore, but that means you lose a significant amount of resources and things like that, which is still very contradictory even today. I myself am very conflicted about it. I don't know about you.
I am, definitely.
It's just a very interesting discussion to delve into the whole censorship aspect of it. In fact, regarding censorship, the Hong Kong Post has been criticized for refusing to mail tens of thousands of leaflets on civil disobedience made by scholarism activists. So, in fact, when it denied scholarism's application to mail these flyers, it told scholarism that the contents breached on its ban on illegal, obscene, immoral, indecent, offensive, and libelous writing. Dude, they're just telling you how to protest and be safe during protesting. So libelous. But the pamphlet essentially contained a series of questions and answers on civil disobedience and explains why genuine universal suffrage goes beyond a one-man, one-vote ballot system. And yet, for whatever reason, this was denied because they obviously don't want scholarism's ideology going out. Another instance is that the Leisure and Cultural Services Department denied the use of Tamar Park to students on the climactic day of their class boycott. Ironically, they were inspired to occupy Civic Square instead, which triggered the umbrella movement. And that's just like one of the many examples of censorship backfiring. So just some background, Tamar Park was supposed to be this huge area that students could use to gather and boycott class. Civic Square was one of the more significant squares because it has a lot of history with the Tiananmen protests. So background for Tiananmen Square as well. This occurred very, very early on. So there was the whole massacre at Tiananmen Square when Chinese tanks essentially rolled into central Beijing to crush this week-long student protest, which called for political change. This, I believe, happened June 4th, 1989, and there's no mention of it in China's history anywhere because, again, censorship. Who controls the present controls the past. Whoever controls the past controls the future. But Hong Kong is the one and only place on Chinese soil that hosts an annual ceremony to commemorate Tiananmen Square every single year. So this has been one of the most attended events in all of history, despite Chinese censors.
Wow. I mean, it's insane to me that something that has been entirely erased from China's history is one of the biggest events in Hong Kong. And it's something that even I know about, and I think a lot of people even in the US know about, and yet Chinese citizens are entirely unaware of.
Yeah, I believe I was watching this one Patriot Act episode. Patriot Act is another comedy show on Netflix hosted by Hassan Minhaj. I believe the show was unfortunately canceled, but one of the episodes was about women's rights in China, which we highly recommend, by the way. And they were talking about censorship and the Tiananmen Square protests. And this interview essentially went around asking a bunch of Chinese citizens if they knew what the Tiananmen Square protest was. No one did, at all. So seeing it just being kept alive in some way within the country is insane. Now, with regards to censorship, I think it's interesting to see how they defend their argument, because kind of going back to cultural relativism, the Communist Party and the Hong Kong government have essentially said that there is a vaguely defined red line, and they repeat that the freedom of expression is not absolute. Hence why they can increase the amount of censorship that's already present in Chinese society as well as Hong Kong society, and essentially just control the spread of information.
What's interesting is that logic on its own isn't surprising. I mean, it's something that's used all over the world. Like, freedom of expression is never absolute. There is a level of censorship that happens in almost every country. Hate speech, for example, is condemned. But it's interesting where, like, that line is drawn in some places versus in China.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like, countries such as Spain, they have a whole illegal association with any sort of hate speech. So you say it once and you're immediately jailed. I think the protest or this conversation arose a lot recently when President Trump was banned off of virtually every single social media platform ever.
Even Shopify.
Which, first of all, what is Shopify? Someone please explain.
Honestly.
Also, how do you get banned from it?
Guess you'd have to ask Trump about that. Maybe incite a mass riot?
Yeah, I'd rather not. I'm perfectly happy with the current political system, please and thank you.
Are you really happy with it?
Better than before. And of course we can spend an episode talking about what's wrong with our current political system, but right now we're talking about what's wrong with Hong Kong's political system.
Exactly.
What's interesting is that the Communist Party's office owns an 80% market share of book distribution and retail in Hong Kong, including 51 bookstores. So these seem like numbers, right? Very arbitrary numbers, but these bookstores don't carry any books that politically disagree to the party. Having that economic power within the state itself is a contribution to censorship. And it's interesting because as much as they're a communist regime, this sounds very capitalistic in nature.
Exactly. I mean, publishing is actually one of the industries in the US that is highly monopolized. Less than 5 corporations own virtually all of the publishing industry.
Now that makes me question how much censorship is present or prevalent within the literature I consume myself.
I mean, I guess the difference is that a corporation has different motives in mind than a government if it's going to censor things.
True, that's fair. The other thing is that a substantial portion of the media is owned by Communist Party allies. So, in annual reports by the Hong Kong Journalists Association, journalists have reported widespread self-censorship within the media. We can consider ourselves like junior journalists, I guess. Take that with a grain of salt. This is more like 2 children putting on a journalist costume for Halloween.
Many grains of salt. Many.
But imagine if we were self-censoring ourselves on the podcast. That was redundant.
Your English teacher would not approve of me.
I know. It's okay. But just not being able to have a platform to say something and not being able to say it in itself because either you have been indoctrinated to believe otherwise or you just have to put out media that doesn't agree with your own personal values is terrifying.
I mean, I can imagine how frustrating that might be for journalists, especially journalists in Hong Kong. Just being able to see the censorship that's happening everywhere.
Going back to, I guess, the umbrella movement, unfortunately, they haven't found a place in any official institutions in Hong Kong, and they've been persecuted against strongly. So a lot of the movement has been expedited to foreign nations instead. For example, Joshua Wong, I believe he and a couple others were sent to the UK in order to escape being, like, killed.
I mean, that kind of reminds me of the situation in Russia with Navalny.
Of course. Would you like to explain?
Yeah, so Navalny is he's an activist in Russia who is essentially against the Kremlin and Putin in general. So he was actually also sort of exiled out of the country as well. But recently he returned to Russia and was immediately put in jail.
Wow. Successful mission, sir. A little bit before that, though, this man was poisoned.
Yeah.
How? Was it like a substance on his clothes or something? Because I believe that's the story I've heard.
Yeah, that's what I've heard as well.
So this man was poisoned, survived the poisoning,
and voluntarily went back to the country from which he was exiled from. But it's crazy to see how much influence he had, because many of his supporters immediately began protesting afterwards.
And in Russia, that's kind of a rare occurrence because of the immense amount of censorship that occurs because Putin's regime.
Again, very similar to China.
I think it's really interesting because contrary to China, which I believe, even though they do a lot of shady, immoral, unethical things, we still hear about them. I barely hear anything coming out of Russia. This was like one of the first protest movements I've ever heard about, ever.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Navalny was the first advocate that I've heard about in Russia, period.
It's just interesting to see the widespread effects of censorship in itself. Unfortunately, it is still a huge part of China where comments of dissent, activism, or criticism of authorities are immediately removed from the internet. So access to many Western media and social media sites is banned in China, which we refer to as the Great Firewall of China. So recently there have been like extradition laws. And in 2019, after the Hong Kong protests against these extradition laws, or the attempt to extradite any Hong Kong prisoners to China for trials. So obviously, real quick with this law, it seems reasonable, but you got to keep in mind that these prisoners are often just activists and protesters who are dissenting and then being sent to China for trials where they'll be facing a harsher sentence, and no one can do anything about it because there's literally no news from China about these things. But essentially, regarding these protests, censors tried to erase all content of Hong Kong rallies or anything that evokes their spirit. One activist stated that he stayed awake all night after the second largest mass protest marches and tried to stay ahead of the censors by sharing videos and photos in mainland social media groups, all of which disappeared almost immediately. That's insane.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Chinese authorities have portrayed the protests as violent events incited by foreign elements eager to undermine Hong Kong and destroy China's one country, two systems policy, which is meant to ensure Hong Kong's position as a global financial center by guaranteeing the right of freedom of speech and right to protest.
Honestly, that kind of reminds me of the different attitudes towards the BLM protests that happened in the summer. Like, you could tell just based on the political party that was reporting on it. You would hear from Democratic news sources, and they would call all the protests very peaceful. And any sort of Republican or right-leaning news source would say the complete opposite and talk about how violent they were.
Which is why I felt the need to kind of diversify what kind of news I was getting and make sure to read and watch news outlets across the spectrum just to understand the idea. Because I remember with the elections in America, I believe it was like CNN who said that Trump was not going to get Georgia or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't think it was Georgia, actually. I think it was a different state. But there was one state where CNN was like, oh, Trump was going to get that state. But Associated Press said no. And I was kind of like, okay, well, CNN's not the most trustworthy source, but it is what it is. We'll see. And then Fox News came out and said that that state would actually go to Biden, and it agreed with Associated Press's information. So I was like, okay, well, normally because Fox is such a right-leaning source, saying that it's going to go to Biden is obviously a very reliable piece of information, even if Fox itself isn't either. Anyway, recently what's kind of not necessarily surprising but intriguing is that China moved to impose censorship over Hong Kong's internet and access users' data using a new national security law. So this online censorship plan expanded powers for the police, allowing them to conduct warrantless raids and surveillance. So even though China has assured that only a small number of people are going to be targeted by the law, the details that have been released since show that it will likely be the most radical change in Hong Kong's freedoms and rights since Britain handed the city back to China in 1997.
Wow. I mean, any time that a state moves to use any sort of mass surveillance, that itself should be a red flag.
I mean, unfortunately, it's going on today. You talk about this a little bit in your research paper, Surveillance Capitalism, where basically social media companies and these multinational corporations are essentially extracting our data from social media websites such as Instagram and Facebook and all of that, and compiling that to create voodoo dolls or models of us to essentially affect our behavior and our thought process, which is really scary.
Yeah, I mean, they're able to create very accurate predictive models, and now it's gone to the point where they don't even have to predict what we're going to do because they're able to control what we're going to do. So to see a state and a government use this model is even more scary.
I'm not gonna lie, that was a really good way to put it because I am now terrified. Thank you for that.
Exactly.
But what about this makes it even scarier is that the police in Hong Kong were granted powers to control and remove online information if there were reasonable grounds to suspect the data breaches in the national security law. Internet firms and service providers can be ordered to remove any information and seize their equipment, with fines and up to 1 year in jail if they refuse to comply. These companies are also expected to provide identification records and decryption assistance.
Again, that's very concerning because reasonable grounds in a legal perspective is a fairly low burden to meet. Reasonable grounds can be anything.
Literally, it's so vague and nothing in... So, You know me, I have a very, very, very minimal obsession with, like, stalking governments and things like that.
Oh, very minimal.
But, so I looked through this piece of legislation, which I guess isn't stalking, but it's funny. It's funnier to say I am, and I'd like to think I'm slightly hilarious to listen to. Anyway.
I mean, the government is stalking you, so you might as well get back at them.
Exactly. Thanks for that. Anyway. But I was looking at this piece of legislation, and they don't define what reasonable grounds means. I've looked up 20 different websites, and all of them are just like, reasonable grounds. What are reasonable grounds? Question mark, smiley face, we don't know. But basically, it's kind of like the amount of power these governments are trying to possess with the amount of ambiguity associated with these laws gives them more power and autonomy to destroy human rights, which is petrifying to think about.
Not to mention that ambiguity also hurts advocates or protesters that want to fight against it, because that's a very easy sort of thing for the government to just bring up, because reasonable grounds is still a burden.
That being said, there is a significant amount of resistance to the censorship. So I know we hate tech companies such as Facebook and Google and Twitter and all of that good stuff, but they said that they've put a hold on requests by Hong Kong's government or police force on information on users. Facebook and its messaging service WhatsApp would continue to deny requests until it had conducted a review of the law that entailed formal human rights due diligence and consultations with human rights experts. By doing so, they essentially put a buffer between the requests of the Hong Kong government, or the CCP and Hong Kong government, and the amount of information that is expedited to them, which is good because that means by having some third party judging what's going to this government, they can limit the amount of access they have to infringing upon the rights of citizens.
I mean, as concerning as it is, the amount of power and influence that these big tech companies are able to hold, it is nice to see that they're using it in a positive way.
Especially because it's kind of like both possess some sort of malpractices, but you have to pick between the lesser of two evils. Luckily, they're not worse than, I don't know, a totalitarian regime. So, I think we're good there.
As far as we know.
Sure. But more civilian directed, there was a protest called the Hong Kong Way, and it's essentially a 38-mile-long human chain that began in late August 2019 and started as a short post on a local online forum suggesting that Hong Kong protesters mark the 30th anniversary of the Baltic Way protests, which was another giant human chain formed in protest of Soviet rule. A few days later, more than 200,000 people joined hands across Hong Kong in a show of solidarity.
Wow.
Exactly. We can't do that anymore because COVID. But
True. It would be a 6-foot distance holding of hands.
Guys, don't do that. It's not worth it. But this call to action could materialize with many volunteers who coordinated through encrypted messaging apps to figure out logistics. So even though these messages would be deleted almost immediately, just having that amount of time to stay ahead of censors and coordinate that much is so significant, especially in that censored society. According to a political scientist at one of the universities, one key reason as to why Hong Kong's protesters have been able to coordinate at such a scale and duration is their sense of collective identity. So essentially, there was a gradual growth in opposition towards extradition, starting with the smaller scale demonstrations in March 2019 and petitions against legislations in May 2019, to marches in historic scale in June 2019. Essentially, that's why it's so resilient. It's simply because of the slow buildup of collective identity from a diverse set of participants. It's not simply the Hong Kong identity that we're talking about here. It's more people's everyday life identity, such as one's professions and neighborhood, that become the strong markers of one's self. Essentially, these ongoing protests have also succeeded in amplifying individual actions. For example, Brian Lung, one of the many protesters who stormed into the city's legislature in June 2019, was the only one to unmask himself. So that's very dangerous because once the government can identify you, they can hurt you as well as your family. But he had to flee Hong Kong, and he continues to do his best to advance the movement in a foreign nation. But in one of his speeches, he said that an important lesson is that social forces are intricately interconnected as networks. Each node of social force brings about new possibilities of further mobilization and challenges to the regime. So, with the power of digital technology that enables so many movements to go ahead and protest and connect and have all these dissenting ideas, is it more a weapon for the government or totalitarian regime to use against these protesters in order to just maintain their control? Just some of my concluding thoughts, I guess. So this one journalist I was looking at, she described Hong Kong's political dissent as an interwoven web, which is much like the distributed leadership structure of the protests. Each person is an intersection, and each of those vertices strengthens the overall integrity of the structure. So the government can arrest dozens of protesters at a time, snipping threads in this web, but the whole thing doesn't come crashing down because other connections prop it back up. That's resilience. And I think she's absolutely right. We see that even in the face of extreme censorship, Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests are persisting and bringing about meaningful change that affects every aspect of a Hong Konger's life. And much of this stems from the fact that people are willing to do their part in joining the resistance because everyone does make a difference. I think it's very important to bring this last quote from 1984 by George Orwell, in which he says, "Everywhere else, all over the world, hundreds or thousands or millions of people just like this, people who had never learned to think, but were storing up in their hearts and bellies and muscles the power that one day would overturn the world. If there was hope, it lay in the protest." This quote, I think, does a really good job of alluding to the amount of humanity and empathy associated within every single participant that brings about meaningful change. The lack of giving up one's identity and maintaining one's own autonomy and sovereignty over themselves in order to do so.
that's why protest is so important, because protest is essentially just a show of individuals' personal autonomy and their ability to make a difference in their government. I mean, that's like one of the reasons that the ability to petition the government is one of the rights in like the Bill of Rights in the US. It's because it's so important to maintaining democracy.
And I think it's important just to apply that in our own lives. These people are protesting despite the amount of censorship, despite the amount of backlash and detrimental consequences this would have for them and their family and in general their security in life. So if they can do it, why can't we?
If a 15-year-old named Joshua Wong is able to start a huge movement in Hong Kong, what's to say that any other person can't do the same in their own lives?
And we can only hope that these protests get to be super influential and more powerful than ever in order to bring about the necessary change that Hong Kong needs.
Thank you guys so much for listening.
We truly do appreciate the amount of support that we've received on our content, especially because we've been, MIA for 400 years.
Yeah, just a little bit. If you want to view any more of our content, you can follow us on whatever listening service you're listening on, whether it be Spotify or Anchor. And you can also check out our Instagram, which is just @PositionalityMedia, where we post some news articles and infographics about some other topics that we don't talk about on the podcast.
We also plan to start adding like mini rants or just discussions in general about some of the ideas that are going on in mainstream media. So this is going to be more real time, per se. So if you're interested in that content, go ahead and give us a follow.
Also, if you want to contact us or anything, we have listener messages on, so feel free to talk to us there. And you can also contact us at our email, which is just positionalitymedia@gmail.com.
If you guys have something interesting to say about current events and society, or in general, just philosophical thought, please give us those listener messages and we might include them in our episode next week. Till next time, guys. Bye!
Bye!